My name is Elaine Carter. I'm 37 years old, and this December, my family finally stopped pretending I belonged. The message came early that morning, as sunlight barely touched the snow outside my window. We're doing a smaller Christmas this year. 7 words that changed everything. No heart emoji, no warmth, not even a signature. Just the clean, sterile tone of finality. I kept staring at it, as if my eyes could force a hidden meaning to appear. Something kinder. Something hopeful. But the truth sat there, sharp and unbothered. It wasn't a discussion. It was a decision. For a while, I just stood still. Not angry, not even sad. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like an echo, not silence. It's the sound that fills the space after years of trying to be understood. And before we go further, if you're watching this, please hit the like button. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and sharing your own experiences helps remind people like me that we're not alone. When I looked out the window, Vermont was painted in white. Snow draped over the pines like frosting, and the cold air shimmered above the lake below. My home stood still and golden in the early light, wide, open, and quiet. It was the kind of place people dream of spending the holidays. But that morning, it felt more like proof than comfort. My $5 million estate wasn't built for revenge. It was built from years of trying to belong, from nights working late when no one believed I'd make it. Every inch of it came from the version of me my family never really saw, the version that didn't need approval to exist. And yet, even after everything, I had still been waiting. Waiting for the invitation. Waiting for the moment they'd say, "We miss you." As if one day, the story might finally turn in my favor. But it never did. Instead, I got 7 words. "We're doing a smaller Christmas this year." I left my phone on the counter and walked through my home in silence. The pine candles I'd lit the night before still filled the air with sweetness. A single Christmas tree stood near the window. Soft white lights, silver ornaments, no presents beneath. It was beautiful, but the space around it felt unfinished. I thought about every Christmas before. The ones filled with forced smiles, whispered comparisons, the kind of tension that hides under carols and laughter. I had been the helper, the listener, the one who made everything easier. I used to think being quiet kept the peace, but it really just kept me small. Some people grow by fighting for attention. I grew by disappearing, and when you disappear long enough, people forget you were ever meant to be seen. That morning, though, something shifted. There was a strange calm settling in my chest, the kind that feels less like sadness and more like release. Maybe this was the universe cutting the last thread I'd been too afraid to let go of. I stepped outside. The cold air hit my face, crisp and clean, and my breath rose in white clouds. The sky stretched pale blue over the tree line, the kind of color that only exists in winter. The world looked untouched, quiet, perfect, waiting. Standing there, I realized how long I'd been living for invitations. Waiting to be chosen, instead of choosing. Waiting to be included, instead of belonging to myself. Maybe this smaller Christmas wasn't a rejection. Maybe it was an opening. I walked down the snowy path toward the frozen lake, my boots sinking into the soft white powder. Everything shimmered under the sunlight, the glass balcony, the windows, the untouched snow, and I couldn't help but smile. For once, the silence didn't hurt. It felt like permission. I started to imagine what a different kind of Christmas might look like, one that wasn't built around appearances or expectations, one that wasn't about being invited, but about being true. Inside again, I poured myself coffee and sat by the fire. The warmth spread slowly, and the crackling of the wood filled the room with life. I opened my planner and stared at the blank square marked December 25th. For years, that date had belonged to them. But now, it belonged to me. I thought of the people I'd met over the years, friends, co-workers, neighbors, each with their own quiet story of being left out, overlooked, or forgotten. People who never quite fit the family picture. The ones who still bought gifts but were never on the list. the ones who smiled through loneliness. What if this house, this space, could be for them? The thought came softly, like the snow itself, gentle, but certain. It grew in my mind until it became a spark of purpose. I imagined lights strung across the terrace, music echoing down the halls, laughter spilling into the winter night. I could see it, a gathering of people who finally felt welcome. I set my mug down and let the idea warm me more than the fire ever could. I didn't need their version of Christmas anymore. I didn't need small. I didn't need permission. Because maybe the best kind of peace isn't about being accepted. It's about creating something beautiful after being dismissed. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the windows, catching light from the flames. Each one landed softly on the frozen ground, quiet but certain of where it belonged. And as I sat there, I realized this message wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something else entirely. They said they wanted a smaller Christmas. But this year, I was going to show them what bigger truly looked like. I've always believed that memories have a temperature. Some are warm, almost golden, the kind that wrap around you when life feels cold. Others chill the skin just by passing through your mind. Mine lived somewhere in between, a lingering frost that never quite melted. The morning after that message, I woke early. The house was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. I made coffee and watched the steam curl into the light. And for a moment, I was back there, last Christmas, standing in my mother's kitchen, pretending everything was fine. She had filled the room with music, carols that sounded cheerful if you didn't listen too closely. The smell of cinnamon and turkey hung thick in the air. My sister's children ran through the hallways in matching sweaters while I stayed near the oven, invisible but useful. That was my role, to make things easier, to fill the silences so no one else had to. When people talk about ghosts, they imagine old houses and flickering lights. But the truth is, the real hauntings come from the moments you survived but never processed. The ones you keep replaying, trying to understand what you could have done differently. Last Christmas was one of those ghosts. I remember my father sitting by the fire, laughing too loudly. His glass always half empty, then half full again. I remember my mother watching him with that polished smile, the same one she used when she wanted to keep up appearances. I remember thinking how strange it felt to be surrounded by family and still feel like an outsider. Like I was present, but pixelated. There and not there at all. By the end of the night, when the dishes were stacked and the music had faded, I caught my reflection in the window. Tired eyes, polite smile, a face trained not to make ripples. I didn't cry then. I just promised myself that next year would be different. I didn't know the universe was listening. Now, sitting in my own kitchen a year later, I realized it had kept its promise, in its own cold, perfect way. This was different. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. The coffee was bitter but grounding. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft and slow, coating the world in silence. I wrapped myself in a wool sweater and walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the familiar things that had become part of me. Every painting, every photo, every corner had a story of how I rebuilt my life, piece by piece, without them. It's strange how success doesn't silence the ache. You can stand in a mansion and still hear the echoes of old wounds. You can build everything they said you couldn't, and still crave a simple invitation that never comes. That's the trick of memory. It doesn't fade when you heal. It just changes shape. As I moved through the rooms, I started to see something clearly. My family hadn't really excluded me last year. I had already begun to exclude myself. I had chosen distance long before they used words to make it official. Maybe their message wasn't cruelty. Maybe it was honesty, the kind that hurts but also frees you. The thought didn't sting. It felt strangely peaceful. For the first time, I wasn't replaying old scenes to prove a point. I was observing them like chapters of a book I'd already finished reading. I went to the large window overlooking the woods. The light outside was blue and silver, the kind that only exists in winter. Quiet, cold, and pure. I could see the trail leading to the frozen lake, untouched except for deer tracks. There was something poetic about it, something honest. Nature doesn't cling, it lets things end. It moves forward. So would I. Last Christmas was gone, but it had left me with clarity. I didn't want to belong to the past anymore. I wanted to build something new, a celebration that didn't depend on bloodlines or expectations, one that was rooted in choice, kindness, and truth. The ghost of last Christmas had finally finished its haunting, and in the stillness of that cold morning, I realized that letting go wasn't loss. It was preparation, because something new was coming, and this time, it would be entirely mine. The first snowfall of the week came heavy, blanketing the long driveway until it vanished into white. I stood at the top of the stone steps, coffee in hand, and watched the world dissolve beneath the quiet weight of winter. Every flake that touched the ground felt like punctuation, the soft, inevitable ending of one chapter before another began. This house had always felt like a dream I still wasn't sure I deserved. 30 acres of Vermont landscape, a 2-story lodge with wide windows that caught the morning light, and rooms that smelled faintly of cedar and old books. When I bought it 3 years ago, I told myself it was just an investment. But standing there now, I could admit it. It was a refuge. I built this estate the same way I rebuilt myself, piece by piece, quietly, with no one cheering. Each beam, each tile, each room carried a story of persistence. Every success that once went unnoticed by my family had somehow found its way into these walls. I had poured years of effort into this place, not to prove them wrong, but to finally give myself a home that didn't depend on their approval. The living room opened toward the forest, a wall of glass that reflected the snow-covered pines. I loved how the light moved through it, the way morning sun slid across the floor and turned everything gold. There was peace here, but also possibility. A space waiting to be filled, not with perfection, but with meaning. That morning, as I walked through the halls, I realized how empty the estate truly was. Not lonely, just unclaimed, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for me to happen. I stopped in front of the dining room. Long oak table, untouched. The crystal chandelier above it sparkled faintly in the daylight. I imagined laughter echoing here, plates clinking, the hum of music and warmth. It felt strange to picture it after so many quiet holidays, but the image wouldn't leave me. Maybe this was what rebirth looked like. Not fireworks, not sudden joy. Just the gentle decision to fill your own silence with life again. For so long, I had associated gatherings with anxiety, the forced smiles, the endless measuring of who brought what, who looked thinner, who succeeded more. But now, standing inside this house that I had built with my own hands, I felt something shift. Maybe family didn't have to mean those who shared your blood. Maybe it could mean those who shared your heart. I walked outside onto the terrace where the wind carried a faint scent of pine and cold stone. The mountains rose in the distance, blue-gray under the winter sky. Below, the frozen lake shimmered, still and unbroken. It was breathtaking, but it was also waiting. And then the thought came again. Gentle, insistent. What if I filled this place? Not with the ones who left me out, but with the ones who never had a place to begin with. Faces flickered in my mind. The woman from work who spent holidays alone after her divorce. The retired teacher from down the road who always waved from her porch. The young barista who told me once that she hated Christmas because it reminded her of everything she didn't have. There were so many of us. The uninvited, the quiet ones, the invisible ones. And I had room for all of them. I went back inside, the idea still alive in my chest. I could almost hear it whispering beneath the creak of the floorboards and the soft hum of the heat. I sat by the fire, grabbed a notebook, and started to write names, one by one. People I'd met, people I'd lost touch with, people who deserved warmth. For the first time, the estate didn't feel too big. It felt exactly right. The house would glow with lights. The scent of roasted pine and cinnamon would fill the halls. Music would echo against the stone walls, soft and endless. The night would be alive again. Not for appearance, not for approval, but for connection. As the fire crackled beside me, I knew this plan wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation, taking back a season that had always belonged to someone else's rules and finally making it my own. Outside, the snow kept falling, heavy and quiet, wrapping the world in white. I pressed my palm against the cold glass of the window and smiled. The house wasn't waiting anymore. Neither was I. This Christmas, the estate would finally become what it was always meant to be, not a monument to what I'd lost, but a home for everything I was ready to gain. The idea started as a whisper, fragile, uncertain, almost ridiculous. By morning, it had become a pulse, something alive, steady, unstoppable. I woke before dawn, when the world was still blue and silent. The fire in the living room had died down to soft embers, and the snow outside glowed faintly in the half-light. My mind wouldn't rest. The thought from the night before, fill the house, had followed me into sleep, then into waking. I sat at the kitchen island with a mug of coffee, staring at a blank page in my notebook. The first few minutes were hesitation. Who would I even invite? Who would care? But the longer I sat there, the more names began to surface. Not relatives, not the people who made silence sound normal. Different names. The ones who existed at the edges of my life. The first was Marie, my old coworker from the publishing firm. We used to eat lunch together in the office break room, both of us pretending not to notice how she'd scroll through old photos of her ex-husband every December. She'd lost everything when he left. The house, the rhythm, the sense of belonging. She once told me she hated the holidays because they made her feel like an unfinished sentence. Then there was Nathan, my neighbor across the hill. Retired teacher, 74. Spent every Christmas alone since his wife passed away. He'd wave from his porch whenever I drove by, but we'd never spoken beyond polite greetings. Still, I'd noticed the way his lights stayed off during Christmas Eve, the way his mailbox overflowed with cards from people who never stopped by. I wrote their names slowly, carefully. Each one felt like lighting a small candle in the dark. As the list grew, so did the warmth in my chest. I added the woman from the cafe who always slipped an extra biscotti into my bag when she thought I looked tired. I added the young couple from the hardware store who'd moved to town last year with no family nearby. I added the intern from my old office who once told me she spent holidays pretending she was on a trip just so no one would ask what she was doing alone. By the time I looked up, there were 23 names. 23 people who, like me, had been left out of someone else's smaller Christmas. I didn't know if they would come, but the simple act of writing their names felt sacred, like reclaiming something that had been taken. Later that day, I stood in the middle of the dining room and imagined it full. The long oak table stretched across the room like a bridge between lives. I could see candles flickering down its length, plates set for every guest, the chandelier reflecting gold in the glasses. For years, I'd watched my mother orchestrate holidays that looked perfect but felt hollow. This time, I wanted something real. I spent the afternoon creating invitations by hand. Not store-bought cards, real paper, heavy and textured, the kind that feels like a promise. Each one carried the same simple line. You are warmly invited to Christmas at my home. No expectations, no performances, just warmth, food, and company. I signed each card simply as Elaine. No titles, no last names, no explanation. Just human to human. By evening, I drove through the quiet Vermont roads, delivering them one by one. I left some in mailboxes, slipped others under doors, and handed a few directly to surprised faces. Every reaction was different. Confusion, disbelief, quiet gratitude, but every one of them carried the same flicker of something rare. Hope. When I returned home, night had settled across the estate. The driveway lights cut through the darkness, glowing softly against the snow. I walked inside, exhausted but alive, and stood at the foot of the stairs, holding the list of names in my hand. It didn't look like much, just ink on paper. but I knew better. It was the start of something powerful. Not an event, not revenge, but connection. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to give meaning to the season. I was building it myself. Over the next few days, I found myself preparing in ways I hadn't expected. Ordering food, planning decorations, walking through the estate, visualizing every detail. The rooms felt lighter somehow, as if they'd overheard the plan and approved. I caught myself humming while I worked. Soft, unfamiliar, unplanned. Maybe happiness doesn't return all at once. Maybe it sneaks back in through small cracks in your routine, testing if you'll notice. I noticed. The invitations went out quietly, without announcement, without social media posts, without fanfare. Just like I had always lived, quietly, deliberately, sincerely. I didn't tell my family. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because it no longer had anything to do with them. This wasn't about proving a point. It was about filling a space that had been empty for too long, not just in this house, but inside me. When I crossed the last name off the list that night, I closed the notebook and sat by the fire. The flames reflected in the window, flickering against the snow. 23 people, 23 stories, 23 chances to rewrite what Christmas meant. For the first time, I didn't feel like an afterthought in someone else's story. I felt like the author of my own. Outside, the snow kept falling, slow, soft, infinite. And somewhere in that silence, I felt the world shift just slightly, as if it had been waiting for this moment too. The days that followed were a blur of motion and stillness, the kind of rhythm that only happens when something meaningful is about to unfold. Each morning, I woke before sunrise, when the light was still silver and the snow untouched. The estate looked endless in that hour, all white, all possibility. I would wrap myself in a thick wool robe, walk barefoot across the cold floor, and light the fire before anything else. The ritual felt sacred, like lighting a signal for the version of myself that used to be too afraid to begin. The invitations had gone out. The names had been written. Now there was only one thing left to do: bring it all to life. I started with the decorations. Not the glossy perfection my mother always insisted on. No symmetrical ribbons or color-coordinated ornaments. I wanted warmth, not performance. I filled the rooms with soft amber lights, garlands of pine and eucalyptus, and candles that smelled like cinnamon and cedar. The house began to glow from within, like it was remembering what joy used to feel like. As I worked, I realized something simple and profound. Preparing this house wasn't just about creating a celebration. It was a form of healing. Every ornament I hung, every light I strung felt like stitching together something I had once lost. The long oak table in the dining room became the heart of it all. I laid it out slowly, layering deep green runners, polished gold flatware, and ivory plates edged in silver. There was something poetic about the repetition. The setting of each plate felt like an act of gratitude. I didn't know who would sit where, but I knew they would belong. In the evenings, I would step outside and watch the house from the driveway. Through the windows, the lights shimmered against the snow, warm and alive. For years, I had been the observer of someone else's perfection. This year, I had built my own. The kitchen became a storm of flour, sugar, and noise. I hadn't baked in years, but it came back like muscle memory. I made cinnamon rolls that filled the air with sweetness and apple pies that browned beautifully around the edges. The refrigerator filled with trays of food, and still, I kept cooking, as if feeding others could finally feed the part of me that had gone hungry for belonging. There were moments of quiet doubt, little shadows that crept in between the glow. What if no one came? What if the silence was louder than before? But then I would remember the list of names, written in my own handwriting, and the way people's eyes softened when I handed them the invitations. This wasn't about numbers. It was about meaning. Even if only one person came, it would be enough. A few days before Christmas, a snowstorm swept through the valley, the kind that turns the world into a painting. I stood by the window, watching the flakes swirl like feathers, and felt a deep calm settle over me. It was as if the storm itself was cleansing the space, preparing it for something new. I spent that night wrapping small gifts, nothing extravagant, just thoughtful things that carried intention. A book of poetry for Marie, a jar of homemade jam for Nathan, wool gloves for the barista who always gave me extra biscotti. Every gift was a quiet message. You are seen. You matter. The next morning, I hired a small local band to play soft jazz on Christmas Eve. I ordered extra firewood, more candles, more everything. The florist arrived with buckets of red amaryllis and white roses. The scent filled the air, mixing with pine and cinnamon until the entire estate smelled like warmth. As I walked through the halls, I felt something stir. Not excitement exactly, but alignment. The house and I were breathing together now, preparing together. I could sense the echo of what was coming, like footsteps approaching from a distance. The night before the celebration, I stood alone in the living room. The fire was roaring, the lights dimmed, the tree glittered softly in gold and white. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the snow continue to fall. I thought of my family, wherever they were. Maybe they were sitting around their smaller Christmas, unaware of what I was creating here. And strangely, that didn't hurt anymore. The ache had turned into understanding. They had chosen smallness, and I had chosen abundance. Sometimes life doesn't take away what you love. It just removes the version of it that kept you stuck so you can build the one that finally fits. I looked around the room and felt it completely. That soft, rare peace that comes when you stop chasing closure and start creating meaning. Tomorrow this place would come alive. Tomorrow the house that was once too big for one person would finally be full. And as I stood there, bathed in golden light, I whispered a silent promise to myself. This time, I won't disappear in the background. This time, I'll be present in every spark, every laugh, every heartbeat of this new beginning. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows like a soft reminder that something beautiful was waiting just beyond the horizon. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to meet it. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in stillness. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the estate covered in a thick, crystalline blanket that glowed under the pale winter sun. Every tree shimmered, every branch bowed slightly under the weight of light. It felt as though the world had paused, waiting, holding its breath. Inside, the house was ready. The rooms were dressed in gold and green, candles lined the halls, and the scent of cinnamon and cedar lingered in the air. Every surface reflected a small piece of warmth. The dining table stood like an altar, surrounded by chairs that would soon hold stories, laughter, and life. And yet, in the hours before anyone arrived, there was only silence. Not the lonely kind, the sacred kind. The kind that happens before something meaningful begins. I walked slowly through the house, tracing my hand along the polished wood of the banister, the edges of the picture frames, the folds of the curtains. Everything was in its place. Everything was waiting. So was I. I had spent days filling this house with light, but tonight, I realized I needed to fill it with something else. Stillness, gratitude, understanding. The kind of emotions that don't glitter but glow quietly from within. I poured a glass of red wine and sat by the window. Outside, the forest looked endless. The sky was heavy with stars, the kind that only appear in deep winter, bright and sharp against the darkness. I watched the reflection of the lights dance across the glass, and for a moment, it felt like I was looking into another version of myself, one who had finally stopped running from her own reflection. For so many years, I had been defined by absence, the seat I didn't have at the table, the invitation that never came, the approval I kept chasing. I had measured my worth through their silence. But now, sitting in my own home, surrounded by the life I had built from that silence, I saw it differently. Maybe being left out wasn't punishment. Maybe it was redirection. I thought back to the girl I used to be, the one who stayed small to make everyone comfortable, the one who said yes when she wanted to say no, who smiled through tension, who mistook acceptance for love. I could still feel her somewhere inside me, watching quietly as this new version of me took shape. I whispered to her, not in words, but in intention. You made it here. The fire crackled, filling the room with a gentle rhythm. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. For a long time, I just breathed, the air rich with the scent of pine and warmth. My thoughts wandered to the names on my guest list, the 23 people who would walk through that door tomorrow. I imagined them stepping into this light, into this space of belonging, each carrying their own story of being left out. It struck me how connected we all were, not by family, but by ache, not by blood, but by resilience. I had always thought of loneliness as something to be fixed, but tonight, I saw it as a bridge, one that could bring people together if we had the courage to meet in the middle. The clock on the mantel chimed softly. 10 o'clock. The night deepened. Outside, a light wind stirred the snow, sending tiny sparkles through the air. I stood and walked through the rooms one last time, turning off lamps, adjusting candles, touching the edge of each place, setting as if blessing it. In the living room, I stopped by the tree. Its lights shimmered faintly against the glass windows. Beneath it, the gifts were arranged neatly, each one small, personal, intentional. I knelt for a moment, resting my hand on the nearest package. It wasn't the gift itself that mattered, but what it represented. Care, effort, thought. All the things I had once begged for and finally learned to give myself. I rose, walked to the fireplace, and added another log to the flames. Sparks rose and vanished in the air like tiny, fleeting wishes. I thought of my family then. Wherever they were, whoever they were when they weren't pretending. Maybe they were laughing, maybe not. Maybe they were content in their smaller Christmas. Either way, I wished them peace. Truly. Because for the first time, their choices no longer shaped me. I returned to the window and pressed my palm against the cold glass. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. She was someone entirely new, softer, stronger, luminous in her own quiet way. There's a certain beauty in the night before everything changes. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just waits, humbly, for the moment life opens its next door. Tomorrow, this house would fill with sound, laughter, footsteps, the low hum of conversation, maybe even tears. But tonight was mine alone. The final pause before the crescendo. I finished my wine, blew out the candles one by one, and let the darkness settle gently around me. The last flame flickered out, leaving only the glow of the fire. As I climbed the stairs to bed, I turned once more to look back. The house glowed like a heartbeat in the snow, warm against the cold world outside. Tomorrow, the story would change forever. And for the first time in my life, I was ready. Christmas morning began with the sound of wind moving through the trees. I opened my eyes to soft light spilling through the curtains, the kind that makes everything look peaceful before the day truly begins. For a moment, I stayed still beneath the blankets, listening. To the house, to the silence, to the rhythm of my own heartbeat. It was calm, grounded, and full. When I rose, the world outside was white and glimmering. The storm from 2 nights before had left everything pristine, untouched. My breath fogged against the cold window as I looked out at the driveway. Soon, it would no longer be empty. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cinnamon. I turned on soft music and lit every candle in the house, one by one. Each flame felt like a small prayer, a quiet declaration that today would be different. The clock ticked past 10. I set out pastries on the long oak table, adjusted the garland, and took one last look at the room I had created. It wasn't perfect. A few lights flickered, a corner ribbon had fallen, but it was honest. Every imperfection felt like proof that this celebration was real. Then, around noon, I heard the first sound, tires on gravel. The crunch echoed up the driveway. My chest tightened. Through the front window, I saw a small silver car slowing to a stop. For a second, I hesitated, frozen in the threshold between solitude and something new. Then I opened the door. Marie stepped out, bundled in a red scarf, her expression unsure, cautious. Snowflakes dotted her hair. When our eyes met, she smiled. Small at first, then wide, like warmth breaking through years of frost. Behind her came more cars, one after another. Nathan, the retired teacher, arrived with a tray of cookies wrapped in foil. The young couple from the hardware store carried a bottle of wine. The barista brought a bouquet of wildflowers, slightly frozen but still beautiful. One by one they climbed the steps, stamping snow from their boots, faces red from the cold. And with each arrival, the house changed. The air grew warmer, the walls seemed to expand, and the silence that had lived here for years began to dissolve. Soon, the rooms were filled with laughter, soft at first, then growing. Someone turned up the music, and the sound of jazz and clinking glasses filled the space. The fire roared brighter, reflecting in the windows like a living heartbeat. I moved through the rooms slowly, almost in disbelief. Everywhere I looked, there were moments, real, unscripted, imperfect, beautiful. Marie sat near the fireplace, her cheeks flushed, telling stories about her grandchildren. Nathan was showing two kids how to play a card game, his laugh deep and contagious. The young couple danced near the window, holding hands like no one was watching. At some point, I realized tears had blurred my vision. Not from sadness, from recognition. For so long, I had chased a feeling I thought only my family could give me. But standing there, surrounded by these people, these strangers turned family, I finally understood. Belonging isn't something you're given. It's something you create. The hours passed softly. Dishes clinked, glasses refilled, the music swelled and faded. I caught fragments of conversations, laughter mixing with the crackle of the fire. It all felt like a dream made real. Fragile, but alive. Late in the afternoon, I stepped outside for air. The sky was turning amber, and the snow reflected the colors of the setting sun. I could hear the faint hum of voices from inside. My home, my creation, my redemption. The cold stung my cheeks, but I didn't mind. For the first time in years, the chill didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like clarity. I thought about the message that had started it all. We're doing a smaller Christmas this year. Those words had once felt like rejection. Now they felt like liberation. My family had chosen smallness, but I had chosen expansion. Not extravagance, heart. When I went back inside, the evening had settled. The lights were dimmer, the laughter softer. I walked to the dining room, where everyone was seated, waiting for me to join. 23 faces turned toward me, eyes warm, plates ready, hearts open. I took my seat at the head of the table. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the gentle crackle of the fire and the faint hum of music from the next room. Then, someone raised a glass. Another followed. And then another. The sound of glass touching glass filled the air like a melody. I didn't make a speech. I didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. We ate, we laughed, we shared stories. The night unfolded like a song, each note carrying a lifetime of silence undone. The house glowed brighter than I'd ever seen it. When I finally looked around, I realized that this feeling, was what I had been searching for all along. Not revenge, not validation, connection. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the girl who once stood quietly in her mother's kitchen had finally found her place. Not by being invited, but by opening the door herself. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and endless. The lights shimmered against the windows as laughter carried into the night. And in that golden glow, I felt it completely. The fullness of life, the peace of acceptance, the quiet power of creating something from nothing. This was my Christmas, my family, my redemption. The morning after the celebration, the world was made of light. Sunlight poured through the windows, glinting off the remnants of last night. Empty glasses, half-melted candles, crumpled napkins, and a scattering of pine needles across the floor. The air still carried the faint scent of cinnamon and laughter. It was the kind of mess that felt holy, proof that life had happened here. I moved slowly through the house, barefoot, letting the quiet sink in. Every room carried traces of warmth. A scarf left on the back of a chair, lipstick on a glass, an echo of laughter that still seemed to hang in the air. For years, I had dreaded mornings after Christmas. The emptiness, the silence, the reminder that celebration had ended for everyone but me. But today was different. Today, the silence felt earned, full, peaceful. I made coffee and stepped out onto the terrace. The snow glittered beneath the pale sun, smooth and untouched except for the faint footprints leading away from the door. The lake shimmered beneath a thin layer of ice. Everything about the world looked clean again, as if the night had washed it pure. My phone buzzed on the counter inside. I didn't rush to check it. I just watched the sky shift from pink to blue, feeling the slow return of reality. When I finally walked back in, the screen was glowing with notifications, texts, tags, and messages I hadn't expected. Photos, dozens of them. Guests from last night had shared snapshots, the glowing lights, the table full of food, the laughter frozen in frames of warmth and gold. Someone had posted a video of the toast, the camera panning slowly across the smiling faces, ending on me. The caption read, "The most beautiful Christmas I've ever had. Thank you, Elaine." Within hours, the post had spread. Friends shared it, neighbors commented, even local pages reposted it. The estate, dusted in snow and light, looked like something out of a dream. And for the first time, my name was being spoken with warmth. Not obligation, not pity, just quiet admiration. It should have felt surreal, but instead it felt right. Like the world was finally reflecting what I'd built inside myself. Then came the message I knew would eventually arrive. My mother. It was a single text, like always. We saw the photos. The house looks beautiful. No apology, no admission, just words, flat and heavy, pretending to be casual. For a long moment, I stared at the screen. I thought of all the Christmas mornings I'd spent refreshing my phone, waiting for her to reach out. And now, when I finally didn't need it, the message had arrived. Funny how life works like that. I set the phone down without replying. Not out of anger, out of understanding. There was nothing left to say. The message wasn't about me anymore. It was about her seeing what I had become without her approval. Later that day, as the sun began to fade, I walked the property again. The snow was deeper now, soft underfoot. I followed the trail down toward the frozen lake, where the world grew stiller and quieter with every step. The air smelled clean, sharp with winter. I thought about last night. The laughter, the faces glowing by candlelight, the feeling of belonging that had filled every corner of the house. It had been so effortless, so real. I realized then that what my family had denied me wasn't love, it was permission to outgrow them. And I finally had. By evening, more messages trickled in. A cousin, an aunt, even my sister. Each one carefully worded, pretending to be curious instead of envious. "We didn't know you were hosting. It looked amazing. Maybe next year we can come." I read them all, and for the first time there was no sting. Just distance. Peaceful, necessary distance. I didn't answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because I wasn't building this for recognition. I was building it for peace. For connection. For all the people who once stood outside the circle, watching life happen without them. That night, I sat by the window again, the fire glowing behind me. The estate looked exactly as it had when I first bought it, quiet, majestic, untouchable, but it no longer felt empty. I could still feel their presence here. Marie's laughter, Nathan's soft stories, the children running down the hallway. The echoes of joy clung to the walls like warmth. The photos online kept spreading. A local paper even shared one, calling it "A Christmas of Kindness in Vermont." I smiled at that. The story had taken on a life of its own, a quiet ripple of connection moving outward. For so long, I had believed that being unseen meant being unworthy. But visibility, I realized, wasn't about attention. It was about resonance, The energy you create when you choose love over resentment, creation over silence. Outside, snow began to fall again, thin and graceful, drifting past the glow of the windows. I opened the door and stepped out onto the terrace. The cold bit at my skin, but I didn't mind. I tilted my head back and let the flakes land on my face. Somewhere behind me, my phone buzzed again. But I didn't reach for it. I had already heard everything I needed to. The world had seen what I created, not for validation, but as proof that pain can evolve into beauty when you stop waiting for permission to live. They had said they wanted a smaller Christmas, and now everyone knew what they'd missed. The knock came 2 days after Christmas. It was late morning. The sky outside was soft gray, and the last of the holiday snow had turned to thin sheets of ice along the edges of the driveway. I was sitting by the window with tea, watching the forest fade into mist when I heard it. 3 deliberate knocks, spaced evenly apart. For a second, I didn't move. I knew that rhythm. I had known it my entire life. When I opened the door, the cold rushed in first, sharp, clean, endless. Then came her. My mother stood on the porch, bundled in her familiar camel coat, her expression polite but strained. The kind of look she wore at funerals or family photos, emotion carefully managed, dignity preserved. Behind her, the snowflakes drifted quietly, catching the light like dust in a cathedral. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She looked past me into the house, the garlands, the soft lights, the faint smell of cinnamon still hanging in the air. I could see her taking it all in, the unspoken recognition flickering across her face. She had seen the photos. She knew. Finally, she said my name. Just once. Quietly. Something in me expected anger to rise, or resentment, or even triumph. But what I felt instead was calm, the kind that comes when the wound has already healed, and all that's left is understanding. I stepped aside and let her in. The house was warm, golden in the winter light. She walked slowly through the entryway, her hand brushing the edge of the table, her eyes moving over the decorations. There was no judgment this time, only curiosity, maybe even awe. We ended up in the living room, standing near the fireplace. The flames cracked softly, and the silence stretched between us, heavy but not unbearable. I realized then that I didn't need her apology. I had stopped needing it the night I decided to fill this house with people who actually wanted to be here. Still, I wanted her to understand. I told her, not in anger, not to accuse, but simply to release. I spoke about what it felt like to always be the extra, the quiet one, the helper. I told her about the message, the smaller Christmas, and the moment I realized that maybe small didn't mean simple. Maybe it meant narrow. Her eyes softened then, just slightly. The cracks in her composure began to show. She said little, but I could see it in her face. The weight of years, the quiet shock of realizing what she had done by omission. Sometimes guilt doesn't speak, it just looks away. We stood there in that silence for a long time. I didn't fill it. I let it do what it needed to do. Finally, I told her something true. That I didn't build this house or this life to prove anything. I built it because I got tired of waiting for love to come from places that couldn't give it. Her eyes glistened, though she didn't cry. She just nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if agreeing with something larger than both of us. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful embrace, just truth, quiet, clean, enough. When she turned to leave, she paused by the doorway, her hand on the frame. For the first time, she looked small, not weak, but human. The kind of small that comes when pride finally loses its balance. I wanted to hate her for the years I'd spent trying to earn a seat at her table. But I couldn't. All I felt was compassion, not for what she'd done, but for what she'd missed. As she stepped outside, the cold wind swept in again, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke. I watched her walk down the steps, slow and steady, until she disappeared down the drive. When I closed the door, the silence returned. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful, like the last note of a song finally allowed to fade. I went back to the window and watched the light shift across the trees. The world felt different, softer somehow. The confrontation hadn't reopened wounds, it had closed them for good. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's just a decision to stop carrying what was never yours. Outside, the snow began again, thin and weightless, falling like grace. A week passed after my mother's visit, though time felt different now. Slower, quieter, softer around the edges. The house still carried the scent of pine and cinnamon, though the candles had burned low. The garlands had begun to fade, but I didn't rush to take them down. There was something comforting in the way they lingered, like the afterglow of a beautiful memory refusing to leave too soon. Outside, the snow had settled into smooth hills of white. The lake was frozen solid, and the forest stood in perfect stillness. Vermont winters have a way of suspending time. The world becomes both silent and alive, paused, yet pulsing. I loved that. In those days after Christmas, I spent my mornings walking the grounds. The estate looked different to me now. Less like a fortress, more like a sanctuary. Every path, every window, every flicker of light felt alive with something sacred. It wasn't just a house anymore, it was a heartbeat. The echoes of the celebrations still hummed in the walls. I could almost hear them, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the low hum of voices sharing stories they'd kept buried for too long. That night had done more than fill a house. It had filled something inside each of us. In the quiet that followed, I started to receive letters. Not texts, not emails. Handwritten letters, sealed in envelopes, left at the gate or slipped into my mailbox. Marie wrote first. She said that night had reminded her what hope felt like. That she'd reconnected with her son after years of silence. Nathan sent a small note in neat handwriting, thanking me for giving him one more Christmas to remember. Even the barista had written, saying she'd never known what warmth felt like until that night, surrounded by people who asked nothing from her except her presence. Each letter was a reminder that something extraordinary had happened here. Not loud or grand, but deeply human. And that's when the idea took root again. What if this wasn't just a moment? What if it became a tradition, one that grew, not from obligation, but from choice? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I had spent my life trying to belong to someone else's version of family. Now, I could build my own. Not once, not by accident, but every year, intentionally, joyfully, without apology. The Vermont Christmas Gathering. That's what I started calling it in my journal. Each December, the doors would open again. Anyone who had been left out, overlooked, or forgotten could come. It wouldn't matter what they had or where they came from. It would only matter that they arrived. The idea filled me with a calm, steady excitement. I didn't need perfection. I just needed presence. That was enough. One evening, I stood outside on the terrace as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The sky burned in soft gold and rose, and the snow reflected every hue. The air was sharp, the kind that stings but wakes you up at the same time. I looked out over the frozen lake and thought about my mother again. I hadn't heard from her since that day, but I hoped she'd found peace too, in her own way, in her own house, with her smaller Christmas. I didn't wish her guilt. I wished her understanding, because that's what I had found here. Forgiveness wasn't something I gave her, it was something I gave myself. It was the quiet permission to keep walking forward without carrying the weight of being unseen. I turned back toward the house, and the windows glowed with their familiar golden light. Inside, the garlands shimmered faintly. The tree still twinkled, and the warmth from the fireplace spilled across the room like a living memory. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing outside looking in. I was home. This wasn't about revenge. It never really was. It was about reclamation, about taking back the parts of life I'd once been told weren't mine to hold. A smaller Christmas, they had said. But somehow mine had become larger than I ever imagined. Not in scale, but in spirit. Next year I'll do it again. And the year after that. and the year after that. Because there will always be someone who needs a place to belong, a warm meal, a door that opens without question. And if I can be that door, that light, that table, then everything I lost along the way will have been worth it. The snow began to fall again, soft and endless, wrapping the estate in white. I breathed in the cold air, feeling both grounded and free. This was my new tradition, and it was only just beginning. If you're watching this, please hit the like button, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and sharing your own experiences helps remind people like me that we're not alone.